Hey everybody, KMO here, and for those of you who care about how the sausage is made, I'm shooting this one on my iPad rather than my Huawei phone. So I'm going to read just a little bit of a Reuters news story. I have no particular attachment to Reuters, it's just a name I associate with generic news. You know, not particularly biased one way or the other. Iran dismisses U.S. claim it was behind Saudi oil attacks. Says, ready for war. Dubai, Reuters. Iran dismissed accusations by the United States that it was behind attacks on Saudi oil plants that risk disrupting global energy supplies and warned on Sunday that U.S. bases and aircraft carriers in the region were in range of its missiles. The drone strikes on plants in the heartland of Saudi Arabia's oil industry, including the world's biggest petroleum processing facility, were expected to send oil prices up $3 to $5 per barrel on Monday as tensions rise in the Middle East. Okay, I'm going to stop there. It goes on. This is an interesting example of the cocktail party psychological effect. You know, you'll be at a party and everybody else's conversation just blurs together into this sort of blanket of background noise until somebody says something that you're particularly interested in. Maybe they say your name and suddenly you hear your name spoken clearly. It just leaps out of that white noise of the background conversations. Or maybe it's some topic that you're particularly interested in. You know, you'll catch, like if it's me, if somebody says artificial intelligence, you know, anywhere in the room, my ears perk up, you know, and I look around for who's talking about it. Or, you know, maybe you've been looking at different cars. You're going to get a new car or a different car. And you've been reading about various models and somebody, you know, turned you on to some particular gem. I don't know a lot about cars. I won't pick any example. But, you know, you start reading about it and you think, yeah, that's probably what I need to get. And then you start noticing them out in the world. You never would have seen them before. You know, 10 of them could have driven past you in a day and you wouldn't have noticed. But now that you're thinking about it, suddenly you're keenly aware of, you know, when one such model is in your vicinity. Well, if I hadn't just read or listened to the audiobook of The Absent Superpower, you know, which has this future scenario of a war in the Middle East, he calls it the next Middle East war, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, I probably wouldn't have paid much attention to this particular news story, even though it's pretty big. I mean, it led my, my morning briefing, my NPR morning briefing that I get through the Amazon Echo. So it was a top story. I mean, it's a big deal. I mean, a big Saudi oil refinery got knocked out by a drone strike by Houthi rebels in Yemen. Yemen, which is on the same Saudi peninsula, you know, the Saudi Arabian peninsula, as the country of Saudi Arabia shares a long border with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has been bombing the shit out of Yemen for a couple of years now. They have blockaded them. There is, I don't want to say starvation, although maybe that's appropriate. There is certainly food insecurity and hunger in Yemen as a result of the conflict with Saudi Arabia. The Houthi movement, you know, according to Wikipedia, includes some Sunnis, which means it's primarily a Shia organization. And it is clearly backed by Iran. Where did the Houthi rebels get a drone capable of delivering enough destructive power to take out a huge Saudi oil refining facility? Did they buy it on Amazon? No, they got it from Iran. So the fact that the Houthis claim credit for it and Iran denies involvement is all ridiculous. I mean, it means nothing. The funny thing is that Iran has accused the United States accusation as being meaningless, but really their denials are so absurd as to be meaningless. I mean, where did the Houthis get a heavily armed drone, you know, that can carry offensive missiles large enough to take out an oil refinery? They didn't build it in Yemen. I guarantee you that. They got it from somewhere using money they got from someone. Who is that someone? Who could it possibly be if not Iran? Anyway, it's just a fun example to me of how when you become aware, and you know, maybe you have not listened to Peter Ziehan's audiobook or read his book or watched any of the videos that I've linked to, but you know, if you've been tuning in to my videos, you've heard just a little tiny summary of what he has to say, including the tensions, the long simmering tensions fueled by the hatreds between the Sunni and the Shia, and which is going to lead to this coming war, open warfare between Saudi Arabia and Iran. This story impacted me in a much more focused and lucid way than it would have had I not taken in that audiobook last week. Just that, nothing more. Just I've been doing this podcast for 13 years now called the C Realm Podcast, and I had the C Realm domain since the mid-90s. C stands for consciousness. I started doing a comic strip when I was a grad student at the University of Missouri. The comic strip was called C, just the letter C. C stands for consciousness. Why have I been abbreviating the word consciousness as C and using it in various projects since the mid-90s? Well, my first semester as a grad student, this was in 94, I guess, I wasn't really aware of the distinction between continental philosophy and recent Anglo-American philosophy. If you take an intro to philosophy class, you're going to get a lot of foundational stuff, Plato and Aristotle, and moving forward, maybe you'll get up to Kant, but it's going to be pretty basic. And once I went beyond the basics, just because of the faculty at the philosophy department and my interests at the time, which were, science and artificial intelligence, I gravitated to the philosophy of science and the philosophy of mind from a recent Anglo-American perspective without realizing that that's what was happening. And I got into grad school, and I didn't pick my courses. I was actually in Japan for registration, and my girlfriend, who was in the U.S., registered for me and picked my classes, and she didn't know anything about, philosophy. She was studying chemical engineering. And she selected a graduate seminar in Hegel. And Hegel is impenetrable to somebody with my interests and backgrounds. It is definitely in the hardcore, what I consider to be European obscurantist sort of philosophy, where if you're not really sure what it is you want to say, make it super complicated, So that course, and reading through the phenomenology of spirit, which is, Hegel's main form of punishment for philosophy students, going forward for hundreds of years, it was such a painful experience. It was such a frustrating experience trying to figure out what the hell this guy was talking about. I remember stabbing the text with a pen, just going, I was so angry with it. But the word Geist or spirit in my translation was translated as consciousness. And I had to write that word so many times in my notes that I just came to abbreviate it as C. And that's the generation of the C in C Realm. So the comic strip was called C. When I first got a website, again in the mid-90s, a friend of mine who knew more about such things than I did, and still does, he registered the domain for me, and he selected the name C Realm based on stuff that I had been posting to this listserv. And so when podcasts came around a decade later and I discovered them, and I started doing a podcast, there was never any question as to what it would be called. It would be called the C Realm Podcast because my website was called C Realm. But, I had the website for a solid decade before I started doing the podcast. And for that decade, it was mostly a place for my online comic strips, which those early strips are no longer available online because they are awful. And I also had a Thought of the Day mailing that I did, and the archive for the Thought of the Day was there on crealm.com. So for C Realm podcast listeners, you probably know this already, but C Realm, the name of the podcast is C Realm because I had a C Realm domain for a decade prior to the beginning of podcasting. Not just my podcast, but podcasting. All right. That is all for this episode of Out of My Head. I hope that you will join me tomorrow because I'll be doing another video.